I should walk over and get my copy of the book here, which has my notes. Many of you already know who Michael Hicks is. I've known Mike for, I don't know, how long, 30 years?
30 years.
Probably 30 years. We were both 10 when we met. Childhood chums, right? Elementary school, no. But I've been in the book business for 40 years, and I've known Mike much of that time because he has proven himself to be such a fine historian and a fine writer. I mean, sometimes those two don't always go well together. Good historians aren't always good writers, and they're not always good speakers. Mike is all those things: a good historian, a good writer, a good speaker, and a fine musician. I didn't mean they were all, only 3 of them were good and 1 was fine. Just the way it came out. But Mike has been a professor of music at BYU for many years.
It's my 30th year.
30th year, okay. The fact that he's survived down there that long is just a modern miracle. But no, I'm kidding.
Or that it survived.
or the institution survived. Many of you know his book, Mormonism in Music, which was published in 1989. That was, you'll probably remember that as being 2 years after I started my business. No, maybe not. Anyway, that is kind of the history on the subject. It's the definitive work. One you may not know, the street legal version of Mormon's book. And I don't know if you've ever done this to rap music or anything, but no. But this is a fascinating. What do you call it? Not a translation.
It's a rewrite.
It's a rewrite of the Book of Mormon. A really fun book. He did a book on rock in the 60s, which we don't have, unfortunately, to show you. But the one that you probably come to hear about tonight, the Mormon Tabernacle Choir, a biography. And I will confess that the fact that Mike was doing the book made it of interest to me, but I thought, how much do I really want to know about the Mormon Tabernacle Choir? I like their music and I listen to them, but do I want to read a whole book about it? And or am I going to blitz through it really quick so I can speak authoritatively? And Brian, our Brian Buchanan here, was so enthusiastic about it, he convinced me that I needed to read the whole thing before Mike came instead of after, And I did, and I'm really glad I did, and found it to be just a fascinating book. It's not, the title is not one that necessarily makes you think there's going to be lots of tidbits and juicy parts and all. It might seem like an official kind of thing, but believe me, it's not, and it's fascinating. You'll love it if you haven't read it yet. The last thing I want to say, besides the fact that I consider Mike not only all those things I said earlier, but a good friend, and I admire him hugely. I'm going to give him credit tonight and thank him for something he has no idea he did for me. In fact, nobody else does know it, but he actually helped me plan my funeral. You didn't know that, did you?
No.
And I'll tell you why. Because years ago, Mike said that Brigham Young's favorite version of Oh My Father was set to the tune of Gentle Annie, which I had never heard of, a Stephen Foster song. And he actually, so that I would have it, made a recording. I don't know if you remember doing that, of Gentle Annie, where he sang it, and I decided right then and there, at my funeral, I'm going to have somebody sing Oh My Father to the tune of Gentle Annie. So thank you very much, Mike. It's beautiful.
You're welcome.
You're welcome, I think.
When is that?
Check the website.
That's why we want you to go to the website. That's a very uncalled for question. You know, it's been close a couple of times, so thanks for asking. Anyway, with that, let me introduce our speaker tonight, Michael Hicks.
Oh, yes.
Let's see how that.
All right.
No, probably not good, is it?
No, do you hear me? Yeah. I think you'll be able to hear me
Okay.
well enough. I will speak up. I'm used to simultaneously experiencing the slow deterioration of my own hearing and speaking to larger and larger groups of students. So I'm used to speaking up. It is a tremendous privilege and sort of almost, you know, you hear it in the news all the time. It's a surreal experience, and I think of surrealism in slightly different terms than the way people apply it, of course, in the news. But this is a veering into surreal territory for me because I've known Kurt for so long. I've been a gleeful customer here, and even when Kurt was selling books at Deseret Book years ago, I would find great things with him and love speaking with him. And he's, you know, you talk about Mormon historians. I don't know where you put him in that pantheon, but he is one of the most important people in the making and writing of Mormon history. Would you agree with that? Some of you, I mean, you know. So I'm just saying this is a beautiful thing for me. So I thank you for the invitation. And I'm really excited about this book. I think it's a very good book, one that you can read with pleasure, and not everyone can read with pleasure. And that's the kind of book you want to write. Okay. I thought of different things that I might say tonight. I don't have a PowerPoint presentation. I did consult the other videos of previous presenters. I was looking for dress code, first of all, and it seemed to be pretty wide open. Normally when I'm teaching at BYU, I do have the tie and the shirt, usually not a white shirt, and denim, just jeans underneath. As I tell my dean, I literally tell him this and it makes him laugh. I say, you know, I'm determined to always be proletarian from the waist down. But, and you can parse that however you want. But I thought for you I'll put slacks on. And I tried to see what the nature of the presentations might be. How are these organized? What am I supposed to say? I'm supposed to review my own book or introduce you to key concepts in the book, whatever. And I sampled through some of these presentations, and they were quite diverse. But then I had the brilliant idea, in a sort of John Cage way, of turning them all on at once, okay, and having actually all of the online presentations on at the same time. And it's quite an experience to hear this crowd of speakers and catching Joseph Smith, you know, these little names and ideas popping through, and occasionally this burst of applause, you know, it's like, okay, that person's done, and so on until they thin out at the end. So that was a sort of musical experience for me. What I decided to do, however, is to go through the 4 most frequently asked questions, since people have learned I was writing this book or had completed this book. This is my own FAQ here for you. I may get stuck a little bit on the first one because I think that its answer is a bit of a sermon in itself. Either that or it's just sort of really indulgent autobiography. But that question is, so how long did it take you to write this book? My stock answer comes from a story about James McNeill Whistler, that is the painter of his mother's fame, who was hired by an aristocrat to paint a portrait. He did one sitting with that aristocrat, painted the portrait, gave it to him. The aristocrat disliked it and would not pay him the fee. And so Whistler took him to court. And when Whistler was on the witness stand, being grilled by the aristocrat's attorney, the attorney said, "So, tell the truth, how long did it actually take you to paint this picture?" And Whistler said, 40 years. And so when people ask me how long it took me to write this book, it's actually, it's a long, long, long time. It's probably about 40 years. And this is where I lapse into maybe self-indulgent, too self-indulgent. Autobiography, all autobiography, of course, is self-indulgent. But because when I was a teenager, I wrote a little bit of music. I played guitar, I played a lot of blues and folky kinds of things and so on, and I'd written a couple things for classical guitar. And then I heard this recording by the Mormon Tabernacle Choir of Randall Thompson's The Last Words of David. And I heard that and I thought, that's what I want to do. I want to write that kind of music. And so I actually asked the teacher, the music teacher at our high school, he had a stack of manuscript paper, orchestral manuscript paper, sitting on the shelf. And I said, if you give me that, I'll fill it with music, and we can perform it. And he says, here, take it, take it. I mean, he never used it. It had been sitting there from the previous music teacher's days. And so I studied, and I wrote, and I did my sort of little rip-offs of Randall Thompson and so on. But it was that Tabernacle Choir recording that actually got me thinking in those terms. And so by the time I was 50, just about the end of being 15, had a work called Psalm 133 for choir and orchestra, and the combined high schools in our district performed it. And I got a little blurb in the paper, you know, picture of me at the piano and so on and so forth. So it was the Tabernacle Choir that actually sort of provoked me. Now at this time, I was basically a young Bible-thumping Pentecostal who was really getting interested in classical or serious music at this time. It was not the interest of the people I went to church with. I did play piano, gospel kind of piano and so on, and strum the guitar a lot in our coffee house and whatnot, but I was getting interested in this other stuff. And when I wrote this piece, the Bible study group that I was with, we also ran a couple of halfway houses at this time, believe it or not, and so that was sort of my whole life consumed with them. I was afraid to tell them that I had written this piece because they would have thought it was too worldly. Now, one of the great attractions that brought me into this church, the LDS church, was the knowing that they would have loved it. That this was the kind of thing that I could not only tell them about, but they say, this is wonderful that you've done this. And so there are many other reasons why I joined the church, and I won't go into that conversion story, but I want you to know that that was a part of it. The aestheticism that I felt and the artistic desire for excellence that I felt in the church that came actually through the Tabernacle Choir, although I don't really cite them normally, but I think in connection with this book it's dawned on me that they were a very important part of my coming to Mormonism. I also remember early in the church listening on a Sunday morning, 1974, to the Tabernacle Choir broadcast and hearing this amazing music that was of a sort that I had not heard under Richard Conde previously. There was a piece by Howard Hanson, I don't remember which piece. They said, wow, this is something, this is right up my alley, this is exactly the kind of thing that I want to write and pursue, because I was getting a little more advanced and modernistic in my thinking and feeling. And again, it was a kind of a confirmation for me. Now I'm going to leap ahead here to graduate school. I'm in Illinois. Well, I loved studying about Nauvoo because I was in Illinois, and so I'm getting every newspaper I can on microfilm, or sometimes in hard copy. I'm looking page by page, every reference to music in Nauvoo. So in the Wasp, in the Nauvoo Neighbor, the Times and Seasons, and so on. I'm just marking them all down. And then, jumping ahead a little further, I've got this job at BYU, 1985. And in 1986 in Boulder, Colorado, they had a meeting of the Sonic Society, not Sonic, like S-O-N-I-C, like the, I think there's maybe one next door. Isn't a Sonic there? No. Not the hamburger place, or not Sonic like sounding, but S-O-N-N-E-C-K, Oscar Sonic, who was an early American music scholar. That society, now it's called the Society for American Music, they were having their national conference in Boulder, Colorado in 1986 in March. And I said, okay, I want to be on this program. You know, I was a young faculty member. I'm on the make. You know, I got to get some things on my resume. And so I sent him a proposal, Brigham Young as a musical entrepreneur. I had some thoughts about it, and I thought, I can do this. And my personal patron saint, if Latter-day Saints are allowed to have those, would be Judy McCullough of the University of Illinois Press, who wrote to me and said, I saw this title on this program, and I wonder if you'd send a copy of the paper to us after you've got it prepared. Well, like I say, I was a young scholar on the make, and I was very interested in Mormon musical history. So, I wrote her back and I said, you know what? Your best-selling lines are American music and Mormon studies. You need a book on Mormon musical history. And she says, okay, send us an outline. And I knew the little Nauvoo part, and I just knew a little bit of Utah and Brigham Young part. That was it. And so it's like, oh my gosh, I've got to just sort of make this up, what I'm going to write about. And so that was the beginning of what became Mormonism and Music, a History, because Judy McCullough sent me that letter. In that book, I deal with the Tabernacle Choir, if you know that book at all. It came out in 1989, and there's a chapter called the Mormon Tabernacle Choir, because there is no other evocative term to use for that chapter. I think I'm just going to say the Mormon Tabernacle Choir. Now, leaping forward yet again, 2006, Lavina Fielding Anderson says, could you write a review of this Heidi Swinton book, America's Choir, for the Journal of Mormon History? I said, sure. And as I looked through the book, which is a sort of high-tech, high-gloss, very colorful, with lots of reds and whites and blues in it, as you might imagine, America's Choir, it's a glorified scrapbook. It's like most books about the Tabernacle Choir. So in my review, I said, you know, I'd like to see a real book about the Tabernacle Choir sometime. Just talk about all the things, because a choir is a really complex organism, and particularly a church choir, and particularly a choir that records for Columbia, and a choir that broadcasts every week on CBS. This has got to have a lot of interesting push and pull to it, and I knew a little bit of it already. And so I sent in the review, they published it, and Lavina said, you're the person who should be writing that book. And I said, I don't want to write that book. I'm really not interested. I was doing other things. I was involved in writing about a lot of new American music that had nothing to do with the church. And I didn't want to be any more that Mormon music guy than I already was. The person that got sent everything to do with Mormon music to review or to write about. You know what I'm saying? I didn't want to be that go-to guy any more than I already was. So, the last leap forward, I had just finished 2 other books. That is to say, one of them had just come out with University of Illinois Press, my fourth book with them on the composer Christian Wolff. And this book, which I published myself for a variety of reasons. And I'm going through files. I got to clear out file drawers because there's only so much room in your house. So I'm going through and I'm finding file after file with stuff about the Tabernacle Choir in it. Things I've taken from minutes of their rehearsals. Things I've taken from the journals of members of the choir. Newspaper clippings. Just files and files. And I sat there and I thought, I've got all this stuff here now. If I sat down right now and wrote a book about the Tabernacle Choir, it would be better than any book about the Tabernacle Choir so far. And having finished these other two things, I thought, I think I'm ready to write this book. I didn't want to write it with just what I had, but that was a foundation. And so over the next year's time or so, I was digging into everything and getting permission to see lots of things and finding out that actually we had a lot of papers at BYU, conductors and so on. Carol Cornwall Madsen, her father had been conductor of the Tabernacle Choir for 20 plus years. And she had all of his papers and gave them to BYU. And I got permission to go into Richard L. Evans's papers, the apostolic office files of the guy who was the voice of music and the spoken word for over 40 years and who pretty much ran the show when it came to the Tabernacle Choir, etc. So the result of all of that, and then, 10 months of writing. Okay, that's how long it took me to write this book, quote unquote. Resulted in a manuscript that, through revisions, readers' comments, proofs, etc., all those things that go into the publication of a book, that's what it took. So yeah, about 40 years. About 40 years. But I wanted to make that clear to you because I think, again, I say it's a bit of a sermon in itself. The second most frequently asked question: do you tell us in this book what happened with Craig Jessup? It rivals the first question, I'll agree with that. The answer is maybe. I'm actually going to read you a little bit from the book on this, if I may, because it is so often asked, and even tonight, as you know, there's people coming up to me saying that was tonight's most frequently asked question. I'm sure at least 3 people asked that very thing. The thing is, the question is a good one, but by the time I get to Craig Jessup in this book, I'm already in a chapter, the last chapter, called The Endless Postlude, which some people will hate, that title, particularly people who are involved with the choir now. I don't feel bad about that chapter title, and I will tell you, because I did have actually inspirational experiences throughout the writing of this book, that one night I awoke in the middle of the night and this thought in my head, the last chapter is The Endless Postlude. That's the title. Because every other chapter had a title that was taken from some quote that's used in the chapter. Just the way that just a habit I have of working. But I didn't know what to call this final chapter, and that was it. So, when you get to Craig Jessup, he appears a little bit before that chapter, but you have to understand that you'll already get it by that point in time. You'll say, oh my gosh, it happened again. Do you know what I'm saying? It's not like, what was Craig Jessup? But like, this is the way it ends. In some way or another, pretty much all the time for Tabernacle Choir conductors. It's a bad breakup. But, as was said even when Richard L. Evans passed away, the choir goes on. And I love postludes. I have nothing against postludes. I play them every week in church. They're not endless. But at some point, the choir will mutate further than it has now. It may eventually disappear. I don't know. But by the time you get to Craig Jessup in here, you'll say, I get it. Now, let me just tell you what it says in here. There's a couple of pages on it. So I'm talking about Mac Wilberg's Requiem, and Mac Wilberg as a composer, and the fact that this Mormon composer, for the first work recorded by the Tabernacle Choir, it's not another Book of Mormon oratory or anything like that. It's a Requiem. It's a Latin Mass piece, which in itself is sort of unusual in its way. But then, one sentence paragraph, you always know to be on alert when you see one of those. But by the time the Wilberg CD hit the shelves, Jessup had resigned. I'll read you just one paragraph and then let you be tantalized to read beyond it in the book. Given the awkward history of choir conductors' exits for a century and a half, Jessup's resignation seemed unremarkable, even though he had served less time as conductor than anyone except Welch since the Salt Lake Tabernacle was built. But, given its suddenness, seeming lack of provocation, and tight-lipped aftermath, his departure stoked more rumors than had any others. What emerged amid the rumors was a contest of implausibilities. On one extreme was the claim that Jessup refused to quote-unquote out gay members of the choir and orchestra to his overseers and so was fired. This was a time of great Mormon angst about gay matters, particularly as the church at the time of Jessup's resignation was about to bankroll and muster volunteers for California's anti-gay marriage amendment, Proposition 8. And the choir had its own odd connection. Barlow Bradford, was becoming less reticent about his own sexuality and would soon marry a man. On the opposite extreme was Jessup's claim that he simply had accomplished far ahead of schedule everything in his personal 20-year plan for the choir. If he stayed on, he said, the choir would stagnate. But the statement's premise was that he in fact had a 20-year plan. The next paragraph, whatever skeins of truth any of those claims contained, three facts are clear, and that's what you'll have to read on to get. Okay? The known knowns, if I may quote Donald Rumsfeld, the known knowns. And, you know, I read this to a colleague and friend of Craig's, and he said, he got to the end of it, and he said, that could not be better said by anyone when he heard the whole thing. And I thought, well, thank you very much, because that's a real tricky one to deal with. And there's a lot I don't know. And Matt Christensen said, this I take with me to the grave. Well, when you hear that, it's like, what? And you're not going to get very far. Well, eventually you'll hear more, because that's the way it works, you know. But it is a contest of implausibilities, I will say that. And in fact, did say that. The third most frequently asked question has been, where can I buy it? The answer for tonight is clear. There's one place, right here, tonight. Now, Amazon's been selling it, allegedly selling it, for weeks. Pre-order, you know. $21.74 the price on it, and
there's no decimal in that.
Yeah. So, but the thing is, they're not actually shipping books. They're saying, well, you know, you may or may not get it by April 15th. I mean, it's just not a good scene with Amazon. Okay, and Amazon has all kinds of issues, as you know. But many people have ordered from Amazon. That's great. BYU Bookstore just today got 12 copies of the book, which I hope will be shelved by tomorrow morning and sold out by the end of the day. We'll see. I was able to do a signing at the Association, the American Choral Directors Association, ACDA, which had its national conference in Salt Lake City at the end of February. And they had 80 books there, but you could only buy them if you were at the exhibit area, and you had to be registered for the conference to be in there. So I did sign some, it was great. And so there were books made. I don't know what the hang-up is getting them out everywhere, but anyway, they were there, and that was the place. And it was kind of fun, actually, to have a published volume and have a little table there and be able to say to people, you know, I want you to know that on this planet, think of the world, envision the gigantic sphere on which you're standing. The only place you can pick up a copy of this book and buy it in the entire world is right here at this little table. I just want you to think about that. And some people did. Now, I'll mention one other prospective seller, and that is Deseret Book. I got this sort of alarmed email from the marketing department at University of Illinois Press several weeks ago, which they said, thought you should know that Deseret Book had ordered 240 copies of your book, and then they just canceled them, canceled the order. And they said because, two reasons. One, an official biography is going to be released soon. And the second thing was, there are things in this book that are not approved by the church. Okay, I was not surprised that they canceled the order. This wasn't really for Deseret Book. I don't know that Deseret Book has ever carried anything I've written before, and if you're serious about Mormon history books, you come here. You don't go to Deseret Book, except when Kurt Bench worked for Deseret Book, okay? So, you know, I wasn't surprised they were carrying it, but I was surprised that they had ordered a whole bunch of them in the first place, and then canceled. So the surprise was they ordered them. And the biggest surprise, and this is something you ought not to do if you ever get into this situation yourself, don't say why you canceled the order, okay? Because I don't know. A few comments were made to me. Kurt Bester heard that, because I made people hear it. And he said, not that you needed it, but your book just got instant credibility. And the marketing department actually wrote me and said, we're strategizing ways to appropriately use this information to boost sales of your book. Anyway, where to buy the book? Well, you know tonight where to buy the book. The last, most frequently asked question is, so where's the choir going? Or, what's going on with the choir? And this is calling for a speculation, the right to make, I don't know that I've earned, but I've taught many members of the Tabernacle Choir. I've been colleagues professionally with many members of the Tabernacle Choir. I've listened to them carefully. I've studied them now a lot. I don't know that I can answer that question. I can just give you my opinion, and it is the opinion of people in the choir as well, many of them, and many people who were in the choir sometimes briefly and decided this isn't for me. The function of the Mormon Tabernacle Choir is really not known anymore, other than to be something that must go on because it's on the marquee of the church. Cecil Samuelson, who was the president of BYU for well over a decade, said something on 3 occasions. I heard him say this in different circumstances, and I love it. and it so much pertains to the Tabernacle Choir. I didn't put it in the book, but I'll share it with you. He says that this came from The Citadel, the book The Citadel by A.J. Cronin. I went page by page through that book. I could never find it, but that's his sourcing anyway. He said, there are some things that are no longer useful but are too good to throw away. And I thought, wow, that's it. The Tabernacle Choir does not convert people. How would it? And when you listen to them on the air, you'd be scratching your head to say, who wants to hear this piece and then the next piece? Whatever the two are, one after the other, okay? So, a Broadway tune and then something from an oratorio. It's not the same audience. We actually had Ryan Murphy, who is the associate conductor, or the assistant conductor, I'm not sure the exact title, of the Tabernacle Choir, speak to the School of Music last week. And he said, we're trying to appeal to the average listener. There's no such thing as an average listener, okay? That's like when weathermen say, we're 5 degrees above normal. There's no normal weather. You could talk about the average weather, but there's no normal. And in the same way, you can't talk about the average listener. Then he said, Brother Murphy, we're trying to target different kinds of listeners. Well, that's not an average. That's just, we're just going to shoot here, we're going to shoot there, and so on, and pick up whoever we can. But what it's all for, people don't know, including people in the choir, more than one of whom has said to me the same thing, which is, it's a really well-oiled machine, but we don't know what it's making. We don't know where it's going. But it's just too good to throw away. I cannot imagine a time in the church, if the church continues more or less as it is, in which the first presidency of the church, to whom the choir has always directly answered, okay? The first presidency will say, enough for the tab choir. That's not going to happen. And so we are in that endless postlude phase. It's sort of interesting. And so, when they had the Muppets scheduled and announced it for Christmas, I thought, are you trying to sell my book? Really? And yet, people loved it. I heard nothing but people who loved that event. But what does it mean? Other than we had this big fun event in the conference center. So those are my top 4 frequently asked questions and the answers I would give them. And now, if you have other questions, I'm opening it up to you. Yeah, there.
I'd be interested to know more about the choir as a business.
Mm-hmm.
You said it reports directly to the First Presidency, but its budget must come from some department. Is it a profitable enterprise? Do they think of it in those kinds of terms?
Yeah.
And the administration, I assume that the members themselves aren't paid, but the administration probably is. Can you talk a little bit about?
Yeah, it is something obviously that has evolved, over many decades. And the first president of the choir was David Smith, who was a member of the presiding bishopric, and he was president of the choir for 30 years. Okay, so they, at that time, this is the front end of the 20th century, they were answering financially and in other ways directly to the presiding bishopric.
So what does the president of the choir do?
Well, the president of the choir, that's a really good question, and that varies, again, quite a bit. But the president of the choir nowadays, and for all recent decades, is, to my knowledge, the liaison with the First Presidency. The First Presidency meets with the president of the choir, and then that goes back to the conductor, and the organists who are part of the choir team, we'll say.
And the president is paid?
The president is not paid. It's a calling. As I say, it was an assignment within the presiding bishopric for 30 years, and then it became an independent calling. Now, it's a really complicated thing because, and the book deals with this to some extent, when you look at how the choir is presented, as it was for decades in General Conference, for example, who gets mentioned first? Or in programs or publicity materials, who gets mentioned first? And over time, the president, who was not mentioned at all, eventually goes up until the president is above the conductor and everyone else. The president helps shape decisions about what the choir is going to do. Now, just going to the financial part of it, I don't know as much about this as I wish I did, but I deal with some of it. I deal with salary information. This is definitely one of the things that Deseret Book would not want me to be talking about. Just at a certain point in time when I had access to those things, more to see how people were valued and what happened with it. I mean, when the first presidency, for example, was Spencer Cornwall at the front end of the U.S. involvement in the Second World War, says, you know what, we're giving you a raise of $100 a month. Not because you've asked for it, but just because we want to say thank you for what you're doing and keep doing what you're doing. Because we want to be representatives of peace in this world. And just out of the blue. So there's discussion about, how much people made, going back to George Carolus, up through Condi in the book. Where does that money come from? Well, three sources come to mind. One is from the church, some sort of church salary for the conductors, for example, and organists, and as time goes on, more and more staff people. Another place was from the University of Utah, because Richard Evans was on the Board of Regents and was able to, in some cases, work out deals where someone was getting paid mostly by the University of Utah for part-time work there, but was also basically a full-time person for the church. The church paid them some, but it was a huge offset that they were taking for a while there. That was sort of a Richard L. Evans arrangement, I'll say. Now, as far as other expenses of the choir, recordings contributed a huge amount. Recordings begin in the 1950s. But in the 1960s, the choir becomes one of the institutions that is bankrolling Columbia Masterworks. They with Eugene Ormandy and the Philadelphia Orchestra, who were playing with them on most of the recordings for a while, and Bernstein and the Philharmonic, those were the cash cows for Columbia Masterworks. And that money was coming back into the choir's coffers. Now, how those interrelated with other coffers, I don't know, but the choir was meant to be self-sustaining through its recordings. You'll read a lot about the recordings history, contracts and so on in the book until you get the creation of the Mormon Tabernacle Choir as a label, which happens in the front part of this century. Why that happens has to do with the orchestra at Temple Square, which is a big part, by the way, of what people see as the decline or the mutation at least, of the choir. Because once you bring the orchestra in, then that's going to change the repertoire that you're going to do. You know what I'm saying? It constrains things in various directions. Orchestras are union organizations. You got to pay orchestras. You don't pay choirs. And the first presidency didn't know that when they created this institution. And they had a contract, the Tabernacle Choir, with the Telarc label, one of the fine classical labels. And Telarc said, we're signatories to the AFM. You've got to pay these players. And the church, through its lawyers, said, this is a First Amendment issue. This is an act of worship for them. We don't have to pay them. And the union said, Well, if they're playing for general conference, that's one thing. That's an act of worship. But if you're playing for Telarc, if you're playing, or if you're recording, they used examples from the past. If you're recording for Columbia Records, that's a monetary transaction. That's a business deal, and you have to pay them. And therefore, that was the end of it with Telarc, and they said, we'll have our own label. We'll just do our own label, because that's the only way we can, in this right-to-work state, not pay the orchestra, and we want the orchestra to be with the choir. Now, it's not an issue for music and the spoken word, because that's a public service broadcast, you see. Now, they make more money per disc, as you might imagine, from having their own label than they ever did before. So the choir coffers are pretty good in that respect, and they can always put out a CD or DVDs or a broadcast for PBS and so on at Christmas time especially. And you know what? You can get to the top of the classical charts on Billboard really easy. If you sold to 30,000 Mormons, which is a really small percentage of the church, obviously, if you sold a classical disc, anything that's a choir is classical, right? No matter what the repertoire, it's number one disc. Do you know what I'm saying? So you say we have these number one records. It's not that hard, given the demographics. Who else buys those discs? I don't know. And who the actual audience for the choir, whether in broadcasts or recordings goes, I don't know. But they own the label, and everything is run through that. They don't have to pay the orchestra. And so it's easy to just sort of keep doing it. That it's pretty self-sustaining, and has been for years, but more complicated when they were with major labels and didn't have an orchestra. That's pretty much, that's a nutshell version of it, yeah. Jerry.
I don't know if this is in your book or not, but I always had the impression that Craig Jessup saw that schism between highbrow, lowbrow in the choir, and he wanted to move it up, bringing in Robert Shaw to do the spoken word.
One of his mentors.
Doing art songs, Francis Thompson songs, trying to elevate the choir to a prominent artistic level. But then President Monson came in with these popular tastes, and that's where the thing got sideways.
Maybe. I mean, that makes a lot of sense, indeed. President Monson, Ryan Murphy used the term, we talked about the genres that the choir sings. I'd never heard this term before, but it's perfect, particularly for President Monson. He said, inspirational Broadway. Now, you'll read in the book, for example, Joseph Fielding Smith saying, I don't think the Tabernacle Choir belongs on Broadway. But the first Broadway album the Tabernacle Choir did came out while Joseph Fielding Smith was president of the church. How did that happen? But think, too, that Craig Jessup was the one that started having Black History Month for the choir on the music and the spoken word broadcasts. And that, I personally think, was more, and you'll get a feeling of that in the book, was more of a problem for him than the other. I will say that it's continued since then, and probably been magnified in some ways, the content of February as Black History Month on the music of the spoken word broadcast.
Bringing in Moses Hogan and people like that, did that just fuel that fire?
Well, that was earlier. I mean, the history of spirituals, so-called, or any kind of black connections in the church is complex. You have spirituals being done, well, even early on. If you think of Stephen Foster songs as, in that vein, a lot of them have that sort of black plantation connection to them. I mean, they're doing that kind of thing in the 1860s, even. And then you get into the early broadcasts starting in 1929, and they're doing spirituals as a component of broadcasts all along, some arrangement or another. So that aspect is always involved. You also have the big problem of blacks in the choir. And the book deals with that in the 1960s, where the first black applicant that we know of tried to get into the choir, and Richard Condy came to the first presidency and said, what do I do? Can I admit them? It's not a very savory moment, because the first presidency under President McKay decides that you have to be temple worthy to be in the town. It's their sort of oblique way of doing it. You have to be temple worthy to be a member of the Tabernacle Choir. But don't tell her that. This was a woman applying. Tell her we're not accepting applications right now. That was a bad moment. That's the kind of thing, again, Deseret book doesn't want probably on their shelf. But it's a real moment, it's a real moment because they're dealing with these issues. And in fact, the first black members of the choir sang at the funeral of David O. McKay. And so the interface with blacks as members of the choir, as you know, got a lot of airtime once it was a televised broadcast. You'd see these same few black faces. Still the same today, you know what I'm saying? The camera seems to be disproportionately drawn to greater ethnicity in the faces of singers. But the musical aspect of it and appealing more and more to that tradition, particularly as a function of Black History Month, is something that's grown. And I think I'm quite certain it's been a point of tension to older members of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. We'll never have really, urban contemporary black music being done. But if you have Alex Boyer, who is another really important, Alex Boyer as a member of the choir and Gladys Knight as a sort of sidebar to the choir. Do you know what I'm saying? There's interesting African-American musical connections and offshoots. In Gladys Knight's case, her creating Saints United Voices, her own choir, singing gospel music and releasing a CD. Music that the Tabernacle Choir would never do. Do you see what I'm saying? So it's a complicated thing. I do think that Jessup had more elitist tastes than some, for sure. But he also had this side. He really felt this was an important thing that the choir needed to do, was to feature spirituals or particular, spirituals or offshoots, that kind of thing. Saints Go Marching In with Boyer doing his melismatic solos over the top, and so, as part of Black History Month. And it was the week, I think it was just the week before he was released, they did what I call the Rosa Parks episode, where the spoken word was about Rosa Parks and her bravery and so on. That was an unusual moment for music in the spoken word. Whether it was any kind of proximate cause, I have no idea. You know what I'm saying? But you look at things and try to interpret the time and tensions involved, potentially. So that's going back to my second frequently asked question. So yeah. Are you calling time on me?
No, is there any more questions?
I have another one.
Those who haven't asked one yet? No, I'm just kidding.
And I can, of course, I'll be around and you can ask questions.
Could you talk just a little bit about some of Ezra Taft Benson's concerns about some of the choir's offerings in the 60s?
Well, the only one that I know of in particular is when they did the This Land Is Your Land LP for Columbia. Why would that be? Well, because it had 2 songs on it, including the title track, that were written by well-known communists, as he said, and that this would bring discredit to the church to be singing the music of these communists, and that this would be used by the communists as tools to sort of, infest the church in some way. It's I suppose, and it's laughable and almost contemptible in some ways now looking back. In its time, probably more typical than we want to admit of our American culture even. But that was the only issue I'm aware of with Benson and the choir, was with that particular thing. And I remember finding that letter that he wrote, sounding the warning, among Richard L. Emmons' papers, and Bill Slaughter being quite taken with it, saying, wow, it's quite a striking letter, but not striking in the context of President Benson or Ezra Taft Benson.
Did the album do well?
I don't know. I'm not the real expert on the sales and marketing of their LPs. Mark Porcaro actually did a dissertation on that, and
I have that one.
could may know more about that. I think it did reasonably well. You know, they've always done the choir records that have done the best historically are Christmas things. That's their cachet. And Craig Jessup, one of his great quotes is, "We should own Christmas." And in some ways, the Tabernacle Choir sort of does at a certain level. Now, the opening of my book was mentioned to you. One of the things I guess I'm proud of, if I'm allowed to be proud, as a Latter-day Saint, and President Benson would say no, but is that the second and the third words in my book are Barack Obama. Talking about the second inauguration and how Charles Schumer announced that the Battle Hymn of the Republic would be sung by the award-winning Tabernacle Choir. And of course, you know, what is the assumption? And then he said, the Brooklyn Tabernacle Choir. And that moment, that was a powerful moment, a humorous moment, but it was a real changing of the guard moment too. Not just for American politics, but for the choir in American culture. And the Brooklyn Tabernacle Choir sang it. I don't know if you remember hearing it, but it was quite a different version of that song. So, but there's still America's choir in some sense. There's a sort of bedrock quality to the choir even today, and you can't take a sledgehammer to it. But its erosion is discerned differently by different demographics, that's for sure. Yeah.
Which transition of conductors do you think people reading the book will find most interesting?
I think that for two reasons, I would say Richard Condy's departure. Even though Welch's was more controversial and questionable in its moment, and Richard Condy was old, and he'd been with the choir. He'd been in some way with the choir since 1937. We're talking about 1973, 74, his last months. But the way that he was such a titan for the choir with respect to Columbia Records and shaping the sound of the Tabernacle Choir. You know, the Tabernacle Choir is a very odd beast in American choral culture, world choral culture. It's a huge choir. It's a gigantic choir. It wasn't that under Ebenezer Beasley. It was when Evan Stevens came in, and that was a remarkable transition too, because Evan Stevens comes in. He's a bachelor in an era where the church is having to deal with the issue of polygamy, and the male sections of the choir are dwindling because they can't come to rehearsal, many of them. And there are also women who are in plural families that can't come. And so you see the choir shrinking, and they're bringing in new members where they can, but it cannot really get above 100 members. 1890 comes, the manifesto, that's a move, that's a chess move, as you know, a singular and extremely powerful move on President Woodruff's part. And within the month, I think they call Evan Stevens to direct the choir. Now, Evan Stevens has been conducting choirs of young people from small children through the teenage years, 4 years in Salt Lake City. He's renowned, and he's been closely involved with the Deseret Sunday School Union, too. So they're putting on these pageants with like 1,000-voice choir, of young people. So he comes into the Tabernacle Choir. Within a year, it's at 600 and some members, because they just come in behind him, but they're very young. And this is part, as you'll read about, this is part of the issue when they take second place at the Columbia World's Fair 1893. That's a very famous event, and that's one of the milestones, with the choir history, the one that's often touted, as sort of the birth of them as a great choir or a renowned choir. It really was. But you had at the time, sorry to go on a little bit long here, but you had at the time people, including Wilford Woodruff, who said we should have had first. We were cheated. The Welsh weren't going to allow these Mormons to win first place, but we deserved it. But the judges were right on. And one of the things that they said and critics said was they're too young. They don't have, their voices aren't mature enough. And that's because he brought in all, Stevens had brought in all these young people. It was a terrific thing for the choir, and to win second place in that competition was unbelievably huge. I mean, it just absolutely was. They should have said hallelujah, but the siege mentality says they were biased against us, right? They were prejudiced. They weren't going to let us take first place. They didn't deserve first place. One of the things I'll say among these inspirational moments in writing the book was early on, you hear a voice in your head sometimes, just a thought comes into your head. But the thought came into my head, and it was a powerful one. The thought was, excavate the milestones. And I thought, okay, that's one of my tasks. And one of them was that 1893 thing that is always brought up. What really happened there? What was that all about with the Scranton choirs and the judges? And why did they take second place? What was the good and bad? What did people think about it? And what did Evan Stevens have to say about it? And how did this change his relationship with the first presidency, etc.? I think it's a really fascinating story. But I do think that the breakup with Condi would probably be more at the top of my list of the choir changeovers because of the way it was done and the bitterness that he felt and expressed about the departure, the release. Okay. All right.
The creaking door gives it away.
Yeah, that's right. Tales from the bench.
How could you not want to read that book? Now, I just want to take issue with one thing that he said. That tonight you buy it here, suggesting that perhaps another night or day you buy it somewhere else.
This is a good point.
This is always the
This
best
is
place.
always the place.
This is the place.
Yes, good. Point taken, yes.
And just a little historical aside, he was alluding to President Benson's talk on pride. And just for fun, I'll ask my Sunday school class every few years this. How many of you remember that great talk that President Benson gave in conference on pride? And 3/4 of the hands will go up, and say, no, he didn't give it. Gordon B. Hinckley did. It was his talk, well, sort of, but he didn't give it. It's so funny because, you can use that as a